And take your seats. We're ready to begin.
Everyone has to sit at the front if you've been standing up and drinking. Damn you. Come down here. Look us in the eyes.
All right. So as you are taking your seats, I'm going to do a little intro. So my name is Katia. I am the Impact Program Coordinator here at The Conduit. I'm very excited to introduce today's event. So tonight we welcome The Conduit's very own John Alexander for an event that's part of his subtly renamed series, How to Save Democracy. Tonight we're meeting the pioneers. Alongside John, we welcome Claudia Juárez, founder and CEO of Democracy Next, and Katie Rubin, founder of the People Act and creative civic change practitioner. The three of them will delve into what democratic reinvention and renewal can look like. But before we jump in, I'd like to thank the Conduit members who are here this evening. But if you're not a member and you would like to find out more about the membership at the club, please head to reception after the event to chat to the team there. Now, it's time to jump in. Please put your hands together for our panelists.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name's John Alexander, fairly obviously by process of elimination. I'm not Katie or Claudia. I am just going to say a word about how to save democracy, what we're trying to do with this series and proposition, and then I'm going to invite you to turn to someone you don't know and have a quick word, because that's going to be the spirit of this evening. So how to save democracy, it has been called until this event Adventures in Democracy, and then we decided to have a fairly obvious rebrand of that. But it is also a podcast that is co-hosted by myself and a woman called Omazine Khalifa, who was an activist during the Arab Spring and then became a politician in Tunisia. And what we're trying to do really with this whole thing, with these events and then with the discussions Omazine and I are having about them, is not really about saving democracy, at least in its present form. I think what we're really doing is saying, actually, we're living in a moment when what we currently call democracy, I would describe, if anyone knows my work, as a kind of consumer democracy, as a democracy where our only agency is to choose between a fixed set of options, where we're encouraged to make that choice on the basis of individual self-interest, and that simply isn't going to provide the means to face the challenges of our time. That's sort of the starting proposition here. So when we're asking the question, how do we save democracy, we're really asking, how do we evolve democracy, how do we deepen it, how do we fulfill its full promise? And the sort of starting parameter of that is the hypothesis that Omazine and I are coming into it with is what might a citizen democracy look like? One where actually people aren't limited just to choosing between what the options they're offered, but have the opportunity to shape what those options are, where we're encouraged and believed in to have the ability to contribute to the understanding of what's best for society, not just representing our own individual self-interest. And sort of the starting proposition here, which we will challenge and which you are also welcome to challenge, because that's the spirit of the thing, is that what we need to do in this moment in time actually is open up our institutions, invite people in meaningful and well-designed ways, because it's actually when we deprive people of agency, when we deprive people of a voice and of feeling any kind of value, that the anger builds, that the resentment builds, and that then we want to tear those institutions down. So just to give a word of the framing of where we're coming from in this series, and as I say, you're very welcome to challenge that. But that's the sort of starting point. Tonight, I am very excited because I love these two deeply. I think they're amazing. So Katie Rubin on the far side, as you've heard, a founder of the People Act. Highly recommend you check this out. There is a reason for that little pun or play on words. And a creative civic change practitioner, Claudia Juárez, CEO of Democracy Next, probably, arguably, one of the most important organizations leading the charge on deepening our understanding and our practice of what citizens' assemblies might be and do in this moment in time. The way we're going to have this conversation, I think we're all aware of the moment in time we're living in, right? Like this is not a sort of, the how to save framing is not a light framing in the events of the last few days even. But we're not going to start explicitly kind of right there. We're not going to start sort of staring at the immediate circumstance. We're going to start trying to sort of hold and look at what might be possible, and then we will bring that back in. So we're neither going to be naive nor are we going to be transfixed, I think is the way we're going to try and hold this. And before we start in that spirit, we want to invite you, as I say, to just meet someone you don't know. This is a bit the practice of the Conduit and a bit the practice of this series. So turn to someone you don't know, if you would, and just have a quick, we're just at this stage, just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to give you much more time in this conversation later. A quick conversation about the question, where do you find hope for democracy? Maybe it's a very short conversation, judging by that response. But I invite you into that, and then we'll come back in just a moment and get into this. Off you go. And if you're on the live stream, make some notes, journal. Okay, folks, I'm going to hold my hand up and say, if you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. If you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. If you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. If you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. Look at that. There's your first little bit of Katie Rubin creative change practice into the room. We're going to start by really defining, we're going to hear from some of you folks in a bit. Hopefully that's given you someone you know that you can kind of feel into this conversation from. But we'll hear from you guys in a little bit. But to stimulate this conversation, we're going to start with these two. And we're going to start really with defining what we're talking about. So there are two methodologies that we're bringing into the room tonight. There are many others, but these two are, I think, are particularly exciting, particularly powerful in this moment. Can I just get a quick show of hands? Who knows what a citizens' assembly is in this room? So most, but some not, and we're doing this for the podcast as well, so you're going to have to listen. And who's come across legislative theatre before? Okay, maybe half or so, a few fewer. Okay, so we're going to start with Claudia. And my first question is really, I'd love you each to share with me and with the room and with the stream and with the podcast, and your favourite example of of the methodology that you're kind of most associated with. And in doing so, kind of unpack the kind of nuts and bolts of what that thing is. So I'm going to come to you first, Claudia.
Sure, thank you, John, and hello, everyone. Really nice to be here. Also great to see so many people who know what citizens' assemblies are. And despite that fact, maybe you don't know about the story that I'm going to share, though. So I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's one of my favorites, and it's from France, where I used to live until very, very recently. And it's from the French National Citizens' Assembly that took place most recently, because there have been two, about end-of-life issues. So the French government had the question of, should we change our existing legislation on issues related to end of life to do with euthanasia and assisted dying and other related issues like palliative care and so on? And if so, how? So to address this question, they convened a citizens' assembly, which meant that they brought together 185 people from across France who were randomly selected through the technical process being called sortition. But it's not really a technical concept. It's a really ancient practice of randomly selecting decision makers. So 185 people selected through a lottery to be broadly representative of the diversity of France. And they were convened for the course of 27 days of deliberation over the course of 4 months. They started at the start of December. They came together in April of the following year with their final recommendations. And during that time, they heard from around 60 different experts, and experts in a broad sense of the term. So also people with lifelong illnesses, from doctors, from researchers, from philosophers, from faith group leaders, and they listened to one another, and they exchanged and they deliberated, and at the end of this process, they drafted what ended up being 67 recommendations that they achieved 92% consensus when they voted to support them, and these were written out in 176 pages of text in their own words. So I give some of these little details to kind of elaborate on how this might be different to other kinds of participatory processes or things that some of you might be familiar with. It's quite an in-depth process that's defined by these principles of sortition, of randomly selecting people, creating this deliberative space where people have the epistemic conditions to really grapple with complexity, diversity of opinions, and to do the hard work of not just aggregating their individual views, but really finding common ground on what do they agree on. And I'll end with the fact that that was not just the end of the process, because then those recommendations went to the French Parliament, went through a parliamentary process. They were on the table for being voted on when President Macron called an election a little while back. So that was the thing that actually slowed everything down. But they were back on the table after the elections, and the legislation has now changed, very largely informed by those recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. So I think
the legislation has now actually changed.
Oh yeah, it has now actually changed. So for me, it's a really powerful example because it just illustrates through these different data points, like how is this different to how we're currently taking decisions, especially really hard decisions, but also, yeah, the impact on legislation, but also the impact it can have on people. Like one of my favorite maybe anecdotes about this assembly process as well is that after it took place, there were a few of the assembly members that were on one of the late night talk shows at like 8 p.m. Talking about this, and one of them was explaining how at the very outset of this process, for religious reasons, she was very much against any form of legislative change, that she didn't want to liberalize anything to do with euthanasia and assisted dying, and how at the end of the process, for religious reasons, she still held those same beliefs, and yet she also voted in favor of the legislative change, and that it was also because through this process she felt heard, she felt more understood, but also she better understood the reasons that other people held around this. And other things she cared about to do with palliative care were also part of the wider set of recommendations. So sometimes we emphasize that like these processes are powerful because people change their minds, but also they're powerful because you might not change your mind, but you'll still be transformed by the process itself.
This is something that I've just been in Ireland and hosting a conversation about the Irish Citizens' Assembly, which is an ongoing institution. But the conversation that came up there was a contrast between the Irish Assembly on abortion that then led to the referendum on abortion in 2018, and a certain other referendum that shall remain nameless.
It can be named.
And the Brexit referendum. And the reason is not, the reason we were talking about this actually was quite interesting to me, was not so much in terms of the legislation that came out or the decision that came out, but in terms of what happened in the country off the back of that. So what was put to me was that in Ireland, in a way, that the national conversation, and partly largely actually because the kinds of people who were on the evening and breakfast TV were the citizens, there was a sense that the country had kind of been brought together through a conversation around a referendum and an assembly, critically, rather than pulled apart.
Yeah, and I think on top of that too, the Irish example you're talking about, the citizens were not just deliberating on should we change the constitution about abortion. It was also if we change it, how should the legislation change? So there was an incredibly detailed set of recommendations that also then went through a parliamentary process, and there was draft legislation. So when people voted in the referendum, they knew what change meant, which, well, I think we can all say was not the case with the Brexit one. So
It still arguably isn't the case. Like, I mean, without even sort of
I mean,
level.
different context, because Brexit is a negotiation, right?
Yeah.
So it's
But
a different case. But
and I want to put this in the context of another. So we are in the UK in a process of looking at end-of-life care here. That is in train. Things are sort of going, but in France, this has been commissioned, discussed, and now done. I'm curious whether you have any reflections on how you would compare what's going on in France, what has happened in France, with what's going on in the UK on this question. I don't know how much you know about it. I know you're not based here.
I'm somewhat familiar. I know less in detail, so you might need to correct me. From what I understood, that there was, I forget what you call it, like a free vote that was not along party lines that was put forward. So there was some legislation that was tabled and I think voted on in favour, but I don't know where things stand. But now it's also through in the Lords maybe.
There's a long process to go.
So there's a long process to get there still.
I think that what I'm nudging at, I suppose, is this thing of, and we're going to come to the conversation about design principles for democracy. This is where we want to play with you folks and get your thoughts as well. But for the democracy we might have, and one of them that was put forward is the word fast. And there is a sense that there is this sort of conversation that these things, that when you try and do assemblies and these sorts of process, it takes forever. And that's why they're not a realistic way to go. But maybe in this context, actually, I mean, how long was the process end to end in France, just for illustration?
I mean, so most of these processes, there's at least 3 to 4 months of preparatory time before it happens. This time took 4 months during the deliberation, and then the longest part was actually once it went into the parliamentary process. So I think, quite often people try to contest the idea of citizens' assemblies, like, 27 days of deliberation, like that's so long, 4 months to prepare this thing, like that just takes so much time. But yet, just think about how many other political issues there's just no action on whatsoever because things are politically stuck in some way, or our other traditional processes also get slowed down in other ways through a royal commission set up on this, or other kinds of processes that we might be more familiar with. So I would actually make the argument that quite often, especially on issues where there might be a political difficulty of taking some decision on it, having such a process in place actually enables being able to take some action faster and also with greater legitimacy because you've had a whole process like the one I just described sitting around it.
Right, and legitimacy being a quality of speed actually, because then something isn't so contested. I want to draw out one more aspect of this that you alluded to, and because I think it'll bridge quite nicely into legislative theatre and Katie's work, which is the way you talked about expertise when you were describing a citizens' assembly. So there can be a suggestion, there can be an assumption that this is about sort of experts out of the way, it's over to the people, but that's not really the case. I think you introduced me to Hélène Landemore's phrase, experts on, what's the phrase? I always get it wrong.
Experts on tap, not on top.
Very nice. Do you want to say a word more about the concept of expertise though? Because there's not just one form, right? Just unpack that a little bit more and then we'll come to Katie.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's a good point to kind of tease apart further, because I think a lot of people assume that if you're talking about a citizens' assembly, because even citizen is emphasized in the term, it's just about asking people what they think. But it's actually more about creating the conditions for people to be able to have a more informed collective judgment based on an issue that they're deliberating on. So there is, of course, the learning phase of these assemblies is the longest part, and expertise takes many forms. Like I intentionally elaborated a little bit on what I meant by experts earlier, because I think sometimes we just assume experts, okay, the university professors perhaps, but actually on all sorts of issues, expertise might be, architects or people working in civil society organizations on those issues. Like and people with life experience, like I said, in this context, it was also people with experience of lifelong illnesses, or in the abortion referendum, people who had abortions, it's quite a vast
It's a big space.
It's a very expansive sense of it. And also in citizens' assemblies, one of the kind of good design principles is also to leave space for the assembly members to be able to demand additional experts of whatever sort before they continue on to deliberations if they feel like they haven't yet heard from a wider range of things, to be able to feel like they can start really drafting recommendations as well.
So they're in the driving seat of the process as well. Coming to you, Katie, introduce us to legislative theatre. Give us your favourite, if you can. I know I've asked both of you to do the equivalent of a parent choosing their favourite child, but...
Yeah. Let's see. So legislative theatre is another participatory democracy mechanism. It comes originally from Brazil. Like various participatory democracy tools, so participatory budgeting comes from Brazil, and legislative theatre comes out of the tradition of theatre of the oppressed, which originated with Augusto Boal and many colleagues in Rio de Janeiro, and really has spread all over the world and is growing around the UK and Europe, and also where I used to work and where I'm from, New York City. And I was thinking about what example to talk about, and like Claudia, I have lots of favorites, but I have to say I'm feeling shook about democracy right now. And I've lived here for 6 years, but I'm feeling so sad about the States, everywhere, here also. And I've been thinking about this story from a long time ago, from the beginning of doing legislative theater in the US, and I'm gonna bring that story. Also because one of the things that I think about a lot with participatory democracy, and we're talking about here, do we have to wait for an invitation from institutional leadership? And so the example I'm going to give is actually grassroots up, whereas a lot of times here in the UK I'm working kind of institution out. So just to give a little bit of context, legislative theatre process, you could call it a process that takes some amount of time, but all together in a public event, we do something we call watch, act, propose, vote. And how that works, really briefly, is that people who are directly impacted by or experiencing any kind of problem, a policy problem, a practice, a design, come together to play games, to tell stories, to recognize the problem, and to build scenes that articulate that problem. So unlike citizens' assemblies, in this case, the community is actually articulating the problem from the front end themselves and using the play to ask a question to their peers. And then all kinds of people from the public come in. Neighbors, peers, policymakers, activists, advocates. They analyze the problem together, but they don't stop there. They actually come up on stage and test out new policies, new designs, new interventions. Iteratively, right? Testing, seeing how these could work so that we get the hands-on experience about what would happen if we tried this or that. And then everybody is ready to propose, to turn those tested ideas that we've negotiated into proposals, and then to deliberate and debate and make amendments until we can vote and get commitments to action. So how does this look in practice? In this example, LGBTQ young people came together in New York City. They were all members of a community organization. And there were lots and lots of stories that were coming up at that time. This is 2014. The very beginning of legislative theater in New York City. And all the problems in New York, and particularly for this community, had to do with the police, or many, many problems. And there was one particular issue that people were having all the time about ID. And so in this story, based on the actors' lived experiences, the scene that they created and performed for this big event, 200 people, was that a young woman was experiencing, a young trans woman was experiencing a domestic dispute. And there were some noises in the apartment. And the neighbors heard the noises and they called the police. And the woman needed help. And the police came to her door and they said, okay, where's your ID? But in New York City and New York State at that time, you couldn't get an official ID with your name or gender marker changed unless you'd had surgery or some other serious medical intervention, which was absolutely not accessible to a lot of people. So she didn't have an ID that reflected her identity, and the police said, you have fake identification. And they said, this is reason to search your apartment. They came in, And they found syringes that she was using for hormones. And they said, this is drug paraphernalia. And they arrested her. And this was a combination of lots of people's stories. And they performed this, and they said, the audience said, wow, we see a lot of policy problems here. We see a lot of problems. We see that the police are discriminating, and that they're bringing violence, and that people are facing harm. We see that there's domestic abuse. We see that neighbors don't know how to support each other, maybe. But we also see that people can't have access to this basic thing, which is an identification that helps them interact with public services. That should be a human right. And just like here, actually, right, people don't automatically get an ID, and that can cause a lot of problems. Now, the actors, at this point, along with their process, they'd done research, so bringing in this expertise, but starting from their own experience, and they understood that the New York City Council, the second council in the United States, and definitely the largest, was considering a municipal ID, a city ID, which was intended to give undocumented immigrants, right, all this stuff is super relevant now for us, the ability to go into public buildings, to talk to the police if they're spoken to, right, to be able to prove their identity. And the young people said, we want to target our legislative theater process so that we can be included in this creation of a new ID. And they invited the chair of the Committee on Immigration, Carlos Menchaca, who was the first gay council member from Brooklyn, who was coming up with the idea for this municipal ID, to their legislative theater event, along with other people from the council and activists, people working on the campaign. But it had, before that, only been talked about in terms of supporting undocumented immigrants. That's really important. And they did this play, and then everyone talked about the issues, and then people started coming up on stage, and they suggested all kinds of ways that the police needed different training, or that we should be able to get support without the police, but also that people should be able to have their identity verified and be able to get the support they need right away. And one of the proposals that the audience wrote was that there should be a New York City ID that anyone could write their gender marker and leave their gender marker blank, which was radical for an ID, and use their name, right, and have ability to get proof that was not medical proof or surgery. And that should be included, because we shared the information with all those 200 people in the new NYC ID. That was just an idea at this point. And this was voted on by everybody. There was so much support for it. And that council member, Carlos Menchaca, stayed after the event for an hour, talking to the actors, talking to the audience, and discussing how this is going to work. And 3 months later, that became part of the official proposal in New York City. And in that same year, it was voted on to become part of the NYC ID. Now, the other thing that was amazing about that was that as part of that event and the comms and the news that were about that event, everyone started to learn about this NYC ID, that before that wasn't, and we can't take all the credit for that, but there was an amazing campaign rolling up at the same time to make this an ID that all New Yorkers would feel proud of, that could include cultural benefits, access all kinds of it, be a library card, all this stuff. And it became an ID that millions of New Yorkers were lining up to sign up for, but essentially had offered this kind of life-saving support, not just for undocumented New Yorkers, but for millions of trans and gender nonconforming New Yorkers. That council member went on to participate in so many legislative theater processes about immigration, about collateral consequences of conviction, to invite them in, right? It went from the outside in, and then it became from the inside, from the government out, bringing those young people back into that space. And I guess I wanted to share that story now because it was, what we're talking about today is where can we find hope? And it was such an amazing opportunity, and this is one of the things that gets me so excited about legislative theater, and then I'll stop, is that we can create spaces where policymakers and citizens can work together as citizens and policymakers crossing those boundaries, meaning that I am also a policymaker. And the policymaker is also a citizen. And he's also there because he has a stake in the game, and he's my neighbor. And I get to build a relationship with him. And I'm also there because I have expertise about what is and isn't working and what should and shouldn't happen. So I'm also a policymaker.
Yeah.
And that's so exciting to me.
I love that you've shared this story because I feel like you've talked yourself back into the power of this thing, right? I met Katie earlier today and she was I've never seen her quite so sort of, and now we're back. This is full Ruben now. Okay. So I just want to draw, and thank you for sharing that story. I don't mean to make like that's a hell of a story. So thank you for that. And it rings completely with some of the things I've witnessed in this space. So the Home Process is working on homelessness, where I was there watching you do this thing and seeing people who've been affected by homelessness. And again, identity issue actually, like can you certify yourself? Yep. Is so often a barrier in accessing these kind of things. Yep. I want to draw out a couple of things. One in particular is this idea that this council member went on to participate in other things. And I think that's also been how some of the citizens' assembly processes have spread and developed and embedded in different places. What do you think that, I guess is a kind of leading question, but can you just dwell in that a minute? Like, what is the experience that he was having?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because when we're kind of supporting communities or local governments or national government also in the UK to do legislative theatre, communities are also saying, how would we get policymakers to take part in this, right? And government stakeholders or policymakers are saying, how do I convince my colleague to do something that seems so out of the box, right? Where we're going to use theatre to make policy? I understand it sounds like a lot. And so, but what that council member experienced is issues that are so often polarized, angry, tense. You go to any public engagement, everybody's shouting at you, everybody's mad, you have to solve everything as the policymaker, right? And you're always getting it wrong. And I feel for them, for some of them, for him for sure. Because they are also, I think a lot about this kind of like, what are the risks we take as citizens and what are the risks we take as policymakers? And policymakers are taking risks all the time to try to get outside the bureaucracy, to try to bend the rules or to change people's minds about something. And we're taking risks just to live in the world. But we don't see each other taking risks. And so the community said, wow, look at this council member. He's getting on stage. We're making jokes. We know his name. We know his background. We solved a problem together. We've transformed something that is such a serious and angry or fearful or a charged issue into an opportunity for celebration that we work together and that we're really doing something different. And that now this is massive, right? That every New Yorker can have an identification that represents their true identity and be safe. It's not the end of the story, right? But it is a part of the story. And so what we see from politicians is that they want to be in spaces that feel collaborative because they think any citizen engagement is going to be angry. And how do we transform this environment? So we say, we know everybody's mad at you. I have a colleague in Zimbabwe that did an amazing legislative theater on climate resiliency, and he wrote an article called When Everybody's Mad at Government, Try Legislative Theater. And it's so true.
There we go. There's a mic drop. We'll just end there. Yeah. But Claudia, I want to come to you on that because you were nodding fairly furiously. But one of the ways that I've seen this depicted and I've kind of latched onto myself is a diagnosis of this moment in time that says we're kind of trapped in a vicious cycle where, and there's all this talk about people are losing trust, levels of trust in democracy are declining and so on. But then putting the alternative proposition, or the complementary proposition, maybe you call it, that actually institutions are kind of losing trust in people. And that then becomes a vicious cycle where people lose trust, start to get angrier, institutions kind of find it harder to put trust in people and do these things, and you end up in that. And it feels like what you're talking to is almost a reversal of that cycle, where actually if enough trust is put in to do one or some of these things, then that starts to build. Do you think that's, how do you see this? Have you seen some of these things? Can you share a bit?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I think quite often when we talk about the kind of trust problem, there's an assumption we're talking about, well, people have lost trust in government or in institutions or in politicians, but actually we don't talk about the other side of that equation of, well, how much do institutions trust the people as well? And then also, how much do people trust one another? And I think processes like citizens' assemblies and legislative theatre help trust strengthen in all of those directions, where just by doing these processes themselves, whether it's a government institution, we also see actually other kinds of organizations like museums and universities and so on that are starting to establish things like citizens' assemblies as well. So institutions demonstrating that they fundamentally trust people by putting assemblies into place. And by participating in them, people also gain, as you were saying, to a greater empathy and understanding of just how hard it is to make these decisions, because so many participatory or engagement processes have been designed in such a way where you are kind of creating the conditions for people to come and harp on about things they're angry about, or if they are particularly motivated on that issue, but it's not a constructive space, it's not a collaborative space. People are really just talking about things from their own perspective, whereas in citizens' assemblies, people arrive and one of the first things they're told is like, you know, it's really amazing you're here and you volunteered your time, but we don't really care what you personally think. You're really here to put yourself also in the shoes of other people and to listen and to work together. And a lot of people kind of sit back when they first hear that, and then there's like a, okay, moment and a shift that happens. And I think we're also seeing at the moment some really interesting design innovations in how citizens' assemblies are done. So the one I did describe is maybe the most classic way, but the permanent Paris Citizens Assembly, to me, has set the bar highest in terms of shifting this relationship between government and the people, because the process doesn't end when the citizens have come up with their initial list of recommendations that get passed on to government. That's just the end of the third out of fourth phases. The fourth phase is a series of workshops that they do together with the elected officials and with public servants to together find consensus on the final text of the local bill that's going to be voted on and then, if passed, enacted. So
just say a word more about the Paris structure and how that works, because I think it's another useful example to bring into the room.
Yeah, so it's been a few years that Paris as a city has set up a permanent assembly that every year in September there's a new cohort of 100 people that are randomly selected. And without going into too many nitty-gritty details, but basically the gist of it is that over the course of that year, one of their tasks is to work on drafting a local bill. So there's a mixed agenda setting that happens in the sense of, in the first instance from the city government, they have an option of 3 different policy issues that are really high priorities, are ones that are being talked about but have no action has been taken yet, and they would really welcome a citizen bill on. And so citizens then deliberate, they vote on which one they want to spend their time working on, and over the course of 9 months they hear from many different experts, and again, in a very expansive sense of the word. So 2 years ago, they worked on homelessness. That involved 11 workshop sessions, but also 7 site visits across the city. And so they do that initial work of coming up with, in this case, around 40 recommendations. And then they worked together in that collaborative sense of 3 facilitated workshops to get to consensus on the final act, which had about 20 articles in it, which incorporated everything except one of those 40-ish recommendations. And so you might say, oh, but there was one thing that didn't make it. But actually, to me, that's a massive win, that almost everything in entirety, and there was actually a debate and deliberation and consensus found to a super high degree, and again, action that has been taken because that bill was then voted on, passed, and is now being implemented.
And thank you for that, because I think like bringing in these where something is actually now part of the whole way that the city is governed, and it starts to hint us into this space of like what democracy do we imagine, which I kind of want to come into. But just before we go there, Claudia, Katie also mentioned the context of polarization and the thing of like if what was it, where if everybody's angry, do legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. If everybody's mad at each other. Yeah.
And am I right, you kind of came into this work from a bit of a perspective of trying to understand polarization and these dynamics?
Yeah, so I started this work around 2012 or so, and my entry point was research that at that time I was doing around populism, polarization, what's driving people to vote and support populist parties, populist leaders, and at the time...
You were onto that in 2012? Good, okay.
Well, I was interested, and at that time, actually, a lot of the academic literature was really focused on the cultural and the economic drivers of these trends, which, of course, are part of it. It's a complex phenomenon, so it's not just one thing that's behind all of this. But that political dimension of, to what extent is people's lack of voice or agency in really shaping decisions, affecting their lives, part of it, that was not as much as part of this. And from the research I was doing at that time, I became really convinced that this is one of the key drivers. It's not the only thing, as I said, but it's one of them. And if we recognize that, then you don't think like, oh, we just need better policies on the economy, or we just need different immigration policies. Like, that alone is not actually going to give people a sense of agency in being able to shape the decisions that affect them, their families, their communities. And so that was my very early pivot to the shifting into, well, what can be a way to give people a genuinely meaningful say in shaping decisions. And what started off as a fairly broad exploration of all sorts of different things and many maybe more participatory methods, crowdsourced things, and so on, that's when I came across this idea of citizens' assemblies. And it was a bit of a light bulb moment, because I think a lot of initiatives are sort of trying to deal with some of the symptoms of these problems, but like, it's going to be hard work to address those deep roots and actually create meaningful ways for people to have an impact, to have power. And so citizens' assemblies, to me, by creating these conditions of both randomly selecting, inherently recognizing that everybody actually has the capacity and the capability to be able to be involved in these really important decisions, as well as creating the space that enables people to grapple with the complexity of them and to do that hard work of finding common ground. It just felt like this is something that's really missing in democracy, and all of these examples that are now just growing. I mean, my previous role at the OECD, we called this the deliberative wave. We have had more and more examples which show that it's not only possible, but it's transformative for policy, for constitutional changes, but also on people. And the research that I did back in 2012, I'm now remembering your initial question, actually found that it was people voting for populist parties in the UK, from the polling that I ran, who were most supportive of wanting themselves to participate in citizens' assemblies, which I think to some people might have been might have gone against some assumptions, but I thought that was really interesting. And it chimes actually with work I've now done. I've been working in this space for about 15 years, and I find it's actually the most, like, people who are closest already to power in more traditional ways who tend to be most skeptical of assemblies, whereas people who are supporting other actors who are kind of claiming to represent the people who are feeling like they don't really have a say, who don't belong, who are being talked down to, they actually feel recognized through these assembly process, where again, the random selection to me is just such a beautiful democratic incarnation of this idea that, like, yes, we are all equally capable, able, we all have the dignity to be there.
We're going to bring in the kind of the challenge of the moment, but just before we come to the audience and hear what you guys, give you a chance to discuss and make some contributions. But just to sort of set that up before I make that challenge, I wanted to bring into the room. So if we imagine a democracy where citizens' assemblies are widespread, kind of networked into these things. There might be standing assemblies like the Paris one going on at multiple levels of government. There might be one, when there's big issues, there might be a one-off assembly. There are legislative theatre processes going on at all these levels as well. Like, just imagining a world where we've designed out of this idea that involving people, giving as many people as possible a meaningful chance to shape, that's the sort of starting principle. So one of the people I've hosted last summer for one of these events was Audrey Tang, who was the Taiwanese digital minister, long backstory, but had played a part in leading the Taiwanese COVID response, which they had publicly characterized by the 3 design principles: fast, fun, and fair. and effectively crowdsourced what was arguably the world's most successful national response. This is an extended trailer for another episode of How to Save Democracy. But what I wanted to do, just to bring this kind of vision of what we're talking about to life, is just invite you both to reflect a little bit on, would you buy those three principles? Would you want to expand on, maybe pick one to expand on? We've talked a little bit about FAST, I think, like in Katie, the idea that you can actually find policy proposals in a room in that time is an expression that Claudia's talked a bit to that. But maybe you could offer a reflection on either fun or fair.
Can I start with fun?
You
please?
can go fun.
Okay. So I talk about fun a lot. I am very serious about fun. I think that fun is deathly serious, and I think that fun is an essential ingredient to our most serious societal and democratic challenges. And I think that's three reasons. And I love that Audrey Tang and Taiwan in this example in the COVID response brought in fast, fair, and fun, because I do think, going back to what I hear from policymakers a lot, what I think we need to do is get people, again, taking more risks and thinking about different ways of inviting people in. What's the invitation? And so to take fun seriously at that level is so wonderful. I'll talk about three things that I think fun does really well. And the first is, and in that example, in other examples, it helps to overturn entrenched power dynamics of decision making, right? It starts to break down. If all of us are laughing, often we start a legislative theater process with a game, and the point of the game always has to be that no one's going to get it right. We didn't play a game tonight. The point of the game is that no one has to get it right, and everyone's going to laugh because we're making a little bit of a fool of ourselves. So we're starting to think about, first of all, I'm not perfect. I'm here working on something just like you. I'm laughing. It's okay to fail. It's okay to experiment. Democracy is iterative. It's a practice. Right? Just like activism is a practice. And we start to say, if we're laughing in a space where we're playful, we can overturn some of those power dynamics. So, yeah, okay. And the second one, I was going to give an example of fun, but I'll keep moving.
I'm going to nudge you into reason two if I may.
The second one is that fun opens up space for creative problem solving. And we haven't said the word creative here tonight, but if I'm going to talk about design values, for me, it's creativity. And how do we encourage and open up and welcome creativity? Because the same old solutions to the problems we have are not working. And this is where I think that we need to be careful about when we open up to expertise. Are we just getting the same answers that we've always gotten before? Right? And so it's so important that we have this range of experts. When we have policymakers in a legislative theater process, we call them policy rangers, like power rangers, who have lots of different powers against the problem, including lived experience, right? So that it opens up space for creativity by playing, by laughing, by seeing a problem in an upside down way. That's the second thing. And the third thing is that it makes us want to come back. It makes it irresistible. And this is what I'm thinking about so much right now, is how do we make democracy and the revolution and our protests and our city hall meetings, everything, how do we make it irresistible? We know there are places people want to go, right? I live in Manchester. They definitely want to go to the football match, right? There's places people want to go, and we know that people are motivated by a desire for community, for shared experience, for fun, for games. And we can do that. And that's, to me, why fun, all those three reasons, is so essential. So I'll stop with fun for now.
Game on with fun. Okay, we're endorsing fun. We're endorsing fast thus far, I think, although you may question. Do you want to take us into fair a little bit? Would you build that?
I can take us into fair, but also just to say, like, +1 to fun. And I do think it's one of the areas that citizens' assemblies don't do quite as well at the moment. Like, they are... the expertise and the learning tends to happen with some PowerPoint presentations, and you might question the experts. There might be like little one-on-ones or cafes around tables and so on, but and long PDF documents. So it is one space where I know there's a lot of innovation though happening, and I think combining things like legislative theater, because I think the kind of practice you describe within an assembly process would be really powerful too, because the randomness has brought in such a diversity of experience amongst that group of people too. So
okay, lovely.
Anyway.
just to underline
Yeah.
that briefly. So not just like multiple of these processes going on in parallel, we want to build all these muscles, but actually starting to weave them together is something you're both nodding heads at.
Yeah. Can I give
Yeah.
that quick example
Yeah.
from Brazil? So there's an idea, and you talked about deliberative waves or kind of waves of participatory democracy, but a lot of us are now talking about an ecosystem, and that all these tools, these methods just work together, and it's all about what does a community need and what does a problem need and what does a place need. And so there's a community in Brazil, Mbujaru. They're doing a citizens' assembly into a legislative theater process on climate change policy. And the Citizens Assembly, they're looking at the problems, they're getting in the expertise, they're coming up with a slate of recommendations, they're deliberating. But then they knew, based on their context, that they needed a space to bring all the different stakeholders, young people, all kinds of residents, policymakers together to really get that buy-in, get that joint commitment, have people understanding the lived experience and why those recommendations are so important, and then also using the legislative theater process to refine the recommendations like we talked about, right? The ongoing process, and to celebrate them and to uplift them, and essentially to have a degree of accountability. Because we see with all of these processes that sometimes in the worst case scenarios, there's a list of recommendations and then nobody looks at them again. And the power still lies with some decision makers. And so what can we do to put those recommendations, those desires of the public into really the public sphere, and how can we use narrative, theater, storytelling, art, all those things to do that? And then the other thing we were just talking about before is that legislative theater or other creative processes could have been used at the beginning of that citizens' assembly to start articulating the problem in people's lived experience, and also just generating those raw ideas that we wanted to get expertise in. So there's so much they could do
It's that
together.
idea of an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah, indeed. I fully agree. And I think in addition to the fun, though, the fairness, I'll come back because I know you want to talk about that too, matters a lot as well. And it matters because if we do want this to actually result in legislation at the end that has been enacted, people should have a sense actually there was a fair process behind this, and it wasn't just about like one shorter moment, but there was greater depth, and there was a lot of expertise and lived experience, but also deeper research and deliberation around it. But I think also one of the fairness of citizens' assemblies that to me stands out from the design of these processes has to do with the sortition. So the random selection, which tends to happen in practice in two stages, where in a first instance, a very large number of people, maybe 30,000, will receive an invitation, usually in the post, that is an invitation written by the Prime Minister or the Minister or the Mayor or people with the authority that are going to be acting on the results of this, inviting people to put themselves forth as assembly members, explaining what is the issue that's going to be addressed. Why is this a problem? How does this assembly work? Explaining that it'll last X amount of days, and answering questions that might put people off, but also encourage them to come, explaining that people will be paid for their time, that childcare will be provided, no, they don't need to wear a suit, like all sorts of things that just try to maximize the number of people that will say yes. And amongst everyone who responds to that invitation, doing a second lottery, and this time the technical world is stratifying, but that just means controlling so that that final group is broadly representative of the diversity of a community. And I think that this matters both for the sense of everyone should have an equal chance of being selected to be part of this in the first place, but also we're creating the conditions for collective intelligence to emerge. So that's also a kind of wonky term maybe, but there's an academic discipline that draws on neuroscience and business and other forms of, and psychology and so on, that shows that actually when you have a more diverse group of people, that leads to better decisions than when you have more heterogeneous groups, including groups of experts who tend to have more similar expertise or experience on an issue. So that diversity in itself also matters. So in addition to the fairness, perhaps the other aspect of sortition that's I think maybe a principle to emphasize also has to do with the collective intelligence. How are we creating the conditions to solve the complex problems that we face today better?
Lovely. And both of these sorts of processes and all the others that we're talking about are rooted in this idea that we're tapping into the ideas and energy and resources of far more people, and they're different contexts, different moments. they might call for different processes. I'm going to skip. I'm going to hold back the question of like, let's bring the world as is into the room, because I think it'll probably come from the room more broadly as well. I'll pitch it at you as we close if I need to. But I want to turn to you guys and give you an opportunity to kind of chew what you've heard. I'm not going to go to questions straight away. Hands. I'd really love to invite you just to talk to one another again. We'll give you a little bit longer this time, about seven or 8 minutes, and because I think it's really important to give a chance to kind of chew this. Part of what you might do might be to discuss and kind of refine a question or a contribution you'd like to make into the room. But I'd love you also just to sit with that question we started this evening with, like, where do you find hope for democracy? Do you find it credibly from some of the examples that have been shared here? And if not, why not? And kind of bring some of those voices to the room. When we come back, what I'll do is I'll set a kind of 59-second limit. It's another little rule that I think I learned from Katie Rubin. So just know that we're going to ask for some quite punchy contributions, but we will. But because we want to hear several voices when we come back. Does that feel all right? So we're going to go 7 or 8 minutes and see where you want to go. And if you're on the live stream, again, journaling is a wonderful way to do this. And you get to make a cup of tea. Okay, folks, away you go.
Or grab a glass of wine.
Yeah. I wanted to bring in another few points on fair, but maybe we'll do it at the end, or it's okay.
If you can see me, raise your hand and shut your mouth. If you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. If you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. Thank you, my friends. I realised there was some reticence in that in the front here. I'd love to hear a few voices. We'd love to hear a few voices. So we'll take a few different soundings, and then we'll come to these guys for some closing remarks. They might not pick up everything, but we'll hear as much as we can. This hand went up so fast that I feel like I might get physically assaulted if I don't come to this one first.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for this incredible conversation. I work with the Together Coalition, and we're working on building kinder, closer, more connected communities. So a lot of this very much aligns with the kind of work we want to do going forward. I think one of the questions I had is, because it's a learning for us as well, is there's so much disillusionment in the UK, and people are, of the mindset that, we're too far gone. There's nothing we can do now. So a lot of those people are disengaged. So for both of these methodologies, what I'm curious about is, how do you move those people, even from a behavioral sciences perspective, how do you move those people to be part of these spaces where they can be part of citizen assemblies or legislative theater?
Lovely.
Mainly because if you don't represent them, then it's not really democratic, in my opinion.
Yeah, okay. And I might expand that out to be a bit of the kind of, is this all a bit naive? Can we really start from where we are? Has it gone too far? You talked about interpersonal trust being really important. Can we really start from the levels of interpersonal trust in the US right now and in the UK? So thank you for that. Let's take another. I'm going to come to one more lady and then to you, my friend. So come to this lady. Oh. Sorry, behind you. I apologise. We'll come to you and then we'll come forward. We'll pass it forward from there. And I'm going to start my 59 seconds. I apologise. I forgot that time.
Right. So
pressure's on.
So the three of us were having a bit of a conversation about the connection between the citizen assembly process and then the broader societal conversation, because you were talking about how sort of that sense of empowerment and not having a voice makes people angry, and I would very much share that perception. But then in some ways, if there's a citizen assembly, I don't necessarily get to be part of it either unless I win the lottery, right? So there's sort of a sense of, do we need to build a different sense of trust for the citizen assembly is empowered, it represents all of us, and we feel happy because we think it could be me and that's good enough? Or is it about those people then going home and telling everyone else, and so there's a larger sort of funnel that goes into the process? So I'm just curious
how do we design the conversation around it? Thank you. If you pass two forward, Katya, if we can.
I guess just maybe more directly following up on this lady's question. I mean, there are lots of political commentators now who are talking about our government's entrenchment in oligarchy. Are we a democracy anymore, And so I guess what I'd say is, while I'm absolutely 100% convinced and have participated in participatory democracy type situations, how do we do that in a world where governments are in league with oligarchs, being ruled by oligarchs, like puppets, really?
Okay, so another kind of challenge of how do we start from where we are, which is a bit different, which is and maybe I'll sort of expand it a little bit again to be kind of, how do we get the people in positions of power now to actually do this stuff, and is there a way to get it adopted without? I'm going to come to this gentleman first because he's been waiting a while.
Thank you very much. Imagine in a year's time we've got 200 citizen assemblies or legislative theatres running in the country, and 200 policymakers involved, and I'm wondering, what are all of the barriers that might prevent that from happening and from being the case? And just to give a quick bit of context, I run Impact 73, which is an in-person interdisciplinary community focused on solving very complex problems. So what I'd like to do is take all of the potential barriers and then help kind of find people that can help work on those and help solve them.
Very nice, thank you. Is there one more that we can have? There's lots more. I'm going to go back to the back of the room. And the gentleman with the glasses, I think I got a reflection from some glasses. Yes.
So on that, I think one of the things that I think about a lot, I work on information, journalism, that kind of stuff, is that the sense of disempowerment that's come with the expansion of the information ecosystem, how much media there is, how much alleged voice people have, I think changes their relationship with decision making. You have an illusion of decision making. So is there some sense in which this sort of despairing situation we're in, where there's a lot of grievance around, we saw that on Saturday with the march, people saying, well, you can excuse it because there are legitimate concerns and all that kind of stuff. What do you see as the relationship between these two processes that you've talked about and then other kinds of participatory work and sort of reconnecting us, the sort of flows of information in society, if you like, that then make us feel like, like was talked about a little bit, it's sort of, rather than being subjected to it, we're actually actively shaping it through information that is coming from citizens, coming from these processes.
Thank you very much. Very good. I think we've probably got enough to chew on, if that feels all right. We may come back out if we feel so inclined, but I'm going to go Claudia first to pick off where you want to, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Where to start? Well, I'm not going to be able to touch on all of it, but I'll start with maybe the oligarchy question and linking up to those first two and last one. But because I think that's a fair, even historical reflection. Like, I think for a lot of people, it felt, I don't know, maybe it still feels radical to say that we're not really in a democracy if we take it by the historical way democracy was defined for a very long time, in terms of how a lot of people find roots of democracy in ancient Athenian institutions, but also other parts of the world when you're looking at this. If you look at the historical definitions of this, actually in ancient Athens, there were about 6,000 positions, and only 10 of them were selected by elections, and the rest by sortition. And this is a sort of historical fact that a lot of people have forgotten.
Isn't there an Aristotle quote about this?
Probably, but if it is, then you can bring it in.
I think Aristotle said that elections are a way to constitute an oligarchy.
And even elections, the etymology of it is linked up to elite. And elections have existed for a long time, but they were considered a form of oligarchy. And so anyways, without going through a whole history of how we got to where we are, but it's very recently in history, basically, just to say that we've even associated democracy with elections. And I think it's pretty legitimate that today many people are just frustrated, also apathetic and disengaged, and not feeling like voting once every 4 years or 5 years, depending on where you live, is actually a meaningful way to shape decisions that are affecting your life, and especially influence decisions that are of such a level of complexity that we're not even using the most effective and useful ways of addressing some of those kinds of problems too. So the fact that we're at a point of maybe some disillusionment crisis, I think, is maybe a good thing. And it's forcing a reflection, it's forcing these innovations. And I'm not saying either, let's just get rid of elections. Like, that also feels like simplistic and not the answer either. I think we need to be evolving beyond the institutions we have, thinking about how do we connect assemblies like the permanent one in Paris, where we're shifting the relationship between elected officials, public servants, and citizens. And I think sortition is one of the ways in which we can be bringing in people who are not volunteering to join a political party, who are not going to town hall meetings, who are maybe not protesting, who've sort of disengaged with the system, because they are invited into a process, but also one where they see, oh, this will actually also have an influence on legislative change or constitutional change or whatever kind of policy area this is in. And just linking up to the question, though, which was fair about, well, if there's a lottery, then how do I actually get involved if I want to be involved? Well, I think, first of all, most people, and I don't think anyone can be involved on every single issue all the time either. So what is a fair process that we have so that there is a broadly representative group of people who is involved in shaping decisions? Because we all also have our families, our work, our hobbies, like all sorts of other things in our lives. Like, if we were involved in trying to shape every policy issue, we would probably not even have time 24 hours a day to do that. So to me, sortition is the fair way, actually, to bring in fairness again, of rotating both that privilege and responsibility and sharing it more fairly in society of how are we influencing decisions that affect us. And that's not to say we shouldn't have spaces or abilities for more bottom-up and activist influence, but I do think that it's not fair if it's only people who are activists on an issue who are having greater influence and we don't have a broader, more representative deliberation also that happens on them too. There needs to be some combination of these forms.
Lovely combination of forms. I just want to ask you to go a word more into the specifics of, okay, so if we are starting from where we are, like, can we expect these processes to be commissioned? How do we get there if not? Like, what's the dance there?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing this up, because I think, like, obviously, if we have one assembly with 100 people once, that's not going to transform anything, in a longer term way or systemically or anything either. And so that's why, for me, so much of the focus of thinking about assemblies and the work that I'm doing and we're doing with my colleagues is around institutionalization, which is a mouthful of a word, but basically by that I mean trying to work towards legal changes to take place, so that there is a permanence to these new institutions that get established, that they therefore also have a relationship with elected officials, with public administrations, and that we're really engaging also with power and finding ways to shift it, but in an ongoing way, so that it's at this stage, we're at a stage where, okay, in Paris, if I take that example I shared earlier, every year there's 100 people who are selected. So you might think, okay, well, if I live there, I have X percent of chances, so still not super high. But the vision, if we imagine it, is what if this becomes something that becomes a normal way of democracy, so that on every issue of, say, all of the councillors, they're having assemblies every year. If it's also something that becomes more normal at the national level, in the museums, the universities, other organizations of our daily lives, then it's not just that one-off chance for that one assembly, it's something that actually everyone does have a chance at some point in their life. Actually, in Athens, they had limits. You could maximum twice be selected for certain positions, because it was happening so often, because there were so many positions where people were selected through random lotteries. So to me, the vision is, how do we work towards that, so that we actually have institutional shifts in power, and this becomes something that's so widespread that we have deliberative cities and deliberative countries. That's something that animates me.
Deliberative cities and deliberative countries. Katie, where do you want to go?
Yeah, there's so many things. I was just thinking about, Claudia, what you were saying, and this question about sort of disillusionment and disengaged, and how I came in here feeling tonight. And you were saying, we have our work and we have our family, so we can't take part in democracy that much. And what I think is also, why can't our democracy happen where our work is, and where our family is, and where our school is, and where our street is? And so why can't we, one of the other ways to start, and of course in citizens' assemblies we're saying there's an issue, and as you said, we're waiting to see if we get a letter, and that's a fantastic way. But also, what if we could say, we are all experiencing things we need right now, and if we could help shape them, that's going to get us hooked into participating in democracy. So we can start with the things that are closest to us. And I'm thinking a lot about, there's a new report from the European Gathering of Democracy Funders, but they talked about all these things we're seeing, all this polarization and violence, they're saying, is a symptom of the decline of the crisis of democracy. And the drivers are unmet needs and unheard emotions. Unmet needs and unheard emotions. And I think that is where my disengagement comes from. I'll speak for myself, right? Definitely it's when it's not fun, but also needs being unmet. And so we can then really open up what we think about polarized groups or political sides or whatever. We talk about who's having unmet needs and what emotions are not being heard, and how can we start from that place, right? So people can be citizens and policymakers in the issues that are important to them. And I think that is another way to think about FAIR, is that lived experience, right? Starting from people who are most directly impacted from by an issue, they are often furthest from solving the problem. And when we have these really broad deliberative spaces, I think we have to be so careful, right, to all of our questions about barriers also, about how do we facilitate to make sure that the people with the loudest voices are not still the ones speaking up all the time in ancient Greece or now. And the other thing I want to say about barriers and sort of what the vision is for the future, because I absolutely want to have deliberative, joyful, participatory, all of those things, cities and countries and places and households and schools and everything. And I think our democracy happens everywhere. And that right, it's not just somewhere, it's not just over there, it's not just city council, it's absolutely a muscle that we build and that we have to build in every space. And so I think that, if we say that every person in the legislative theater, we say everyone is an actor because we all take action. And we say, and John says, everyone's a citizen, right? Not in the legal sense, but in the sense of people who live in the world and therefore are experts in how the world works for them and for their communities and for their neighbors. And if we also said that everyone is a policymaker, I would like to say, in terms of the barriers and the way we could multiply this, that everyone is also a facilitator, a practitioner, a leader, a sparker, right? That we're democratizing democracy. We're not saying only some people can do it. We're not saying it can only happen in some buildings. We're not saying it can only be on some issues or waiting on some schedule. We could say, what if all of us could lead these things? And John and I are part of a movement, I'll close on this right now, that's called Our House, that's thinking about how do we bring all these tools together to get folks to feel like they have the capacity to imagine, design, and demand an entire new system of democracy. And that's what's exciting to me. We can start with all these tools. We don't end there. We're not one process at a time. We're not one issue at a time. We're creating an entirely new model.
And we're not also waiting for someone to do it for us. We're starting to articulate what we might want our democracy to look like. Which gives me a lovely note to bring the evening to a close just by looking back a little bit at some of the conversations I've had as part of this series to date, and forward briefly to some of what's coming in the future. We have 4 episodes of the How to Save Democracy podcast live, which include conversations with Baratunde Thurston and his partner Elizabeth Stewart, who are the hosts of the How to Citizen podcast in the States, using the word citizen as a verb, which is really about this exploration of how do we step into our power from where we are? What is it to start to manifest the democracy, this kind of democracy, but in our everyday practice? And another is with Paul Hilder, a political strategist, and the writer Ece Temelkuran, who wrote the book How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship, really getting into what is the real nature of this challenge in this moment in time, what's underneath the surface of that. And there's this powerful thought of like what we need in this moment is politicians and institutions who are prepared to step into being vessels and vehicles and channels, not providers of all of the answers. So there's some lovely crunchy stuff that's come up tonight in there. Looking forward, we're going to have Audrey Tung's episode out in the world. We're going to have Brian Eno out in the world. We've already recorded some of those. And just to give you a sight of what's coming, on October the 13th, if that's a Monday, Lily, thanks Katya. We've got Caroline Lucas and an amazing young woman called Ellie Meredith looking at like this moment from climate politics. And after that, November the 10th, I've got Gabriela Gomez-Mont and a guy called Smári McCarthy, though Smári was involved in the crowdsourcing of the Icelandic constitution, and Gabriela ran the process to crowdsource Mexico City's constitution, and we will be launching the Our House campaign in some ways at that event as well. So those are a couple of dates for your diaries. For now, we're going to wrap up. We're going to invite you to head upstairs if you want to have a drink and continue the conversations that look like fairly juicy ones. And really embarrassingly, there's some copies of my book if you'd like to buy them. That feels like a really horrible place to end, but the joys of that. But will you join me first of all, last of all, in thanking Katie and Claudia and we'll see you next time.